Tonight, on Closer Look, the practice of renovictions in the province and how they're turning some renters' lives upside down. A large group of people in Ontario have been plunged into turmoil by renovictions tied to one Toronto businessman, Michael Klein. Recently, Village Media reporters Taylor Pace from Guelph Today and Joe McGitty from Cambridge Today concluded an investigative piece on what they called the King of Ontario renovictions. And they join us now to talk about their story. Joe, I'll start with you. Maybe describe what a renoviction is and what prompted you and Taylor to investigate Michael Klein and his companies.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So renovictions is a term that describes a process used by landlords to evict tenants from their units, which are typically below market value. So this is all done under the guise of renovations. So this process is initiated by a notice called an N13, which actually requires the tenant to leave the property while extensive renovations are underway, effectively ending the tenancy. So once these tenants leave their unit, the property owner will, sometimes charge double than what the previous, tenants were paying. This has become a common tactic to get around, rent controls and just increase profits, but at the cost of existing tenants. So the tenants do have the legal right for first refusal, meaning they're allowed to return into the unit after the work is completed, but the timelines could be given, like several months up to a year, like the case of the Klein affiliated buildings. And what kind of prompted us to look into this? So the name Michael Klein has become synonymous with renovictions in Ontario, and Taylor was actually looking into a Guelph building and just notified me that there was a connection to an apartment in Cambridge, and it might be worth checking in. So, went down there, checked it out, talked to some of the residents. We learned pretty quickly that these were not the only two buildings that shared, the same billing addresses, management company. One name kept on popping up, and it was Michael Klein. There were some reports of Klein in other media, but no one was able to go beyond just surface level investigation. So we just decided to dig deeper and see what we could find.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Joe. I appreciate that explanation. Taylor, I know you spent a fair bit of time attempting to track Klein and his associates down. Walk us through that process. What was involved and maybe some of the biggest obstacles you had to navigate their attempts to obscure their involvement from everything?
Honestly, the biggest obstacle was finding him in the first place and making those connections. As a businessman, he doesn't really have a digital footprint on the internet. You can't find anything about him, about his career over the years, and he's been doing this for a long time. And as Joe said, you can't really find anything about the odd mention. You can't really find anything but the odd mention in an article where they just say, we couldn't contact him. Those who work with him, they're easier to find, but they wouldn't talk. So while we didn't talk to him, we did track him down. And that really started with talking to the tenants of these buildings, seeing their N13 forms, which is how we came across some of the business addresses on Tychos, on Bathurst. It spiraled from there. One of the other challenges was that he seems to make a new corporation for every building he buys. So it's really hard to make those connections. We filed a Freedom of Information request to get every corporation he's ever been linked to and filtered through that, pulling out any relevant properties. We reached out to a number of phone numbers, a number of email addresses that we'd received from sources. They did not answer any of those calls. And we did go to these addresses, and we think we saw him in the window of his house. And then we believe his son, Shia, who claimed to be a neighbor, confronted us as we were leaving.
All right, let's talk about those affected, Taylor. How are tenants coping with the emotional and financial toll of renovictions? Did you notice any common themes in their stories?
Yeah, it's been really hard on a lot of them. They're obviously frustrated. They're stressed out. The confusion about what's going to happen next is creating a lot of fear, a lot of uncertainty, and it's really exacerbating everything for them. Like we mentioned in the article, some of them are even afraid to leave their units at this point. But I think one of the common themes is that they're coping by taking a stand and fighting back. They feel they're being treated unfairly, and they want to see some accountability and justice.
Joe, how widespread is the practice of renovictions across the province? Are there particular cities or regions where it's more prevalent than others?
Yeah, so this practice, it's not just for, big players and corporations who are, buying up buildings all around the province. It can be very grassroots level where, a property owner with a single unit could issue an N13 as an excuse to end a tenancy. So it's kind of happening, all over the place. And very few cities or municipalities are actually immune to this kind of behavior. In places like Hamilton, they have passed a renoviction bylaw that would require some landlords to prove that any renovations would require the displacement of the tenants. So they have to go to City Hall and kind of get all the right permits. Municipalities like Toronto are looking to follow suit. It could implement similar bylaws. And then I know in Cambridge here specifically, they're also looking into the same thing, but nothing quite has materialized yet. But they are starting to happen more in densely populated areas where rents have, risen dramatically over the last couple of years. So if you have a tenant who's been in there for 20 years, paying under $1,000 for a 3-bedroom or 2-bedroom, if those are market value now over 2,000, you might want to check your mailbox for an N13.
Okay, let's build on that. Taylor, clearly the landlord-tenant laws currently aren't sufficient enough to protect these vulnerable tenants. Joe brings up some good points, and things need to change. Are there any other further reforms being discussed right now to address what we would call this systemic issue?
It's really just the renoviction bylaws that are being looked at. I believe Toronto just passed theirs last week. So something like that requires landlords to get a permit to do the renovations. It requires them to prove the renovations are necessary and also to provide housing for the people who need it if they have to leave. Otherwise, they will be fined daily, I believe. So Guelph is actually considering this. As Joe mentioned, Hamilton has already passed one. I think it's being talked about quite a bit across the province. But besides that, there isn't much for renters to do besides just know their rights. So if you're given an N13 form, you're not obligated to sign it. You're not obligated to leave. And you have a right to a hearing with the landlord-tenant board.
All right. Joe, last word to you. Any updates since the story was published?
So since the story was published, me and Taylor, we've been contacted by, various lawyers, kind of tenant advocacy groups, and just tenants thanking us for the work that we've been doing in telling this story. But we're also just trying to find out more information about Klein, because even the deep dive that we've done, there's still so much out there that people are still trying to learn. We still haven't heard from Klein, family properties, or kind of anybody associated with the buildings as of yet. We know the tenants in Cambridge, they're staying put. They're not going to go anywhere. They're waiting to have their meeting at the landlord-tenant board just for next steps. But they don't want to leave. So here in Cambridge, like I said, they are looking at implementing a renoviction bylaw, which would prevent this kind of process from continuing. But it's just been words so far, so no action here yet.
Village Media reporters Taylor Pace from Guelph Today and Joe McGiddy from Cambridge Today with tonight's Closer Look. Thanks to you both.